In this video, we'll cover the basics of HTML and its cousin XML. In this class, we'll mostly deal with HTML, but we'll also encounter XML. They both belong to the same family of languages, known as markup languages. They also share the same terminology and lots of history, so it makes sense to talk about them together. In the last lecture, we've already seen what an XML file looks like. It's a text file with some content and some tags that define the structure of a web page and how the content should be displayed in a browser. And this is what an XML document looks like. XML, by the way, stands for Extensible Markup Language. As we can see, it's also a text document with some tags. Both HTML and XML are so-called markup languages. Markup languages have a long history predating the web. Originally, they were used by publishers to mark up manuscripts for printing. In early 1980s, people created a markup language called Standard Generalized Markup Language, or SGML. As the name suggests, it's supposed to be this one markup language that it can be used for everything. But, as you can imagine, something trying to work for everything ended up so complex that it becomes not good for anything. So later, part of it was used to create HTML for displaying web pages, and part of it was used to create XML for describing data. There was an attempt in late 90s and early 2000s to make HTML conform to XML rules, but the latest HTML standard, which is version 5, abandoned that attempt. Today, we'll first cover the basics of XML and use it to introduce some terminology and concepts, and then we'll move on to HTML. Here's an example of an XML document. The first line is called a declaration. Declaration specifies the version of XML used for this document and the encoding of the document. And then we have tags like user, name, office, and so on. Notice that most of the time there's an opening tag and a closing tag. Closing tags start with a slash. But sometimes both the opening tag and the closing tags are combined together, like the phone tag, where the slash is at the end. A tag may have attributes. An attribute has a name and a value. For example, here's an attribute type, whose value is faculty. Note that attribute values are strings in double quotes. Another commonly used term is element, which refers to everything from an opening tag to a closing tag. For example, the user elements includes everything from here to here. Everything between the opening tag and the closing tag is called the content of the element. For example, the content of the name element is Chengyu San. Elements that have no content, like the phone element, are called empty elements. The top-level element in a document, like user in this example, is called the root element of the document. These are the terms we just introduced: declaration, tag, attribute, and element. You may be wondering about encoding. Well, that's actually a somewhat complex subject. I'm going to refer you to this article. Which is called "The Absolute Minimum Every Software Developer Absolutely Positively Must Know About Unicode," and the character says, parentheses, no excuses. The author of the article is Joe Spolsky, who was the co-founder and CEO of Stack Overflow, which I'm sure many of you have used before. The article is very well written, so please read it. And for our purpose, if you are not entirely clear about encoding, that's actually okay. Just remember to use UTF-8 for encoding. There are two important concepts related to XML: well-formedness and validity. First, an XML document must be well-formed. There are a bunch of rules to determine if an XML document is well-formed. It'd be boring and unnecessary to list all the rules, so I'm just going to use an example here. Note that in this example, the parts that cause the document to be not well-formed are highlighted in purple. First, the rule says that XML is case-sensitive, so if the opening tag is name in lowercase, the closing tag has to be in lowercase too. And then here, an opening tag must have a closing tag. If an element is empty, the tag must close itself. And here, elements must be properly nested, not overlapping with each other. So we need to switch user and users. And this one may not be very obvious. Some characters are considered special characters in XML, like the ampersand here. If you use these special characters in content, you must replace them with an escape sequence, like this. So now the document is well-formed. A well-formed XML document still needs to meet another requirement: validity. For example, suppose we made a typo. Instead of name, we typed name. Notice that this document is still well-formed, but it's no longer valid. So how do we find out this type of errors? The answer is that we cannot detect this type of errors just by looking at the document itself. We'll need a specification outside the document to tell us what elements can be used in a document and how they can be used. One type of specification for XML is called Document Type Definition, or DTD. We don't have time to go into the details about DTD, but by looking at an example, you can get the idea of how it works. Take a look at this sample DTD. Notice that this DTD basically says that the root element of the XML document must be TV schedule. And then it says that a TV schedule element should have one or more channel elements, and a channel element should have a banner element followed by one or more day elements, and so on and so forth. Once you have a DTD for your XML documents, it should be referenced in the documents. There are two ways to do it. If the DTD is on your computer, you can reference it as a private DTD by specifying the path to the DTD file. If the DTD is a standard DTD, you can reference it as a public DTD by specifying its name and URL. Here's an example of referencing a private DTD. And let's see some examples of referencing public DTDs. And these are some examples of older versions of HTML pages referencing public DTDs. Note that this weird looking part is actually the DTD name, which is this part. And this part is the URL of the DTD, which is this part. Okay, here's a brief recap of the XML basics that you should know. First, understand the terminology like tags, attributes, and elements, as they are also used for HTML. Then the two concepts, well-formedness and validity. Know what a DTD is and how it's referenced using a doc type declaration. Now let's move on to HTML. Here's the structure of a HTML file. It starts with a doc type declaration. The root element is HTML, which usually contains a head element followed by a body element. The doc type declaration specifies which version of HTML or XHTML the document uses. It's not uncommon to see web pages that use HTML4 or XHTML1 these days, but new websites should stick with the latest HTML5 standards. Incidentally, the doc type declaration for HTML5 is actually the simplest. It's just doc type HTML, as in this example. In this class, we'll only use HTML5. Comparing to XML, HTML is more forgiving when it comes to well-formedness. In particular, tag and attribute names are case insensitive. Some tags are self-closing, for example, the meta tag and the line break tag, which means that they don't need closing tags. And for some tags, closing tags are optional, like the paragraph tag and even the HTML head and body tags. The head section of an HTML file contains elements that provide information about the web page rather than the content of the page. In this example, we have a meta tag here that specifies the character set of the document, and a title tag here that specifies the title used in browser tab. The body section contains elements that will be displayed in the browser window, like in this example, the level 2 heading tag or H2 tag here. So what tools should we use to create HTML documents? There are three types of tools that are commonly used. The first type is usually called text editors for developers. They are basically text editors but with additional features for programming. There are some excellent choices in this category, like Sublime Text, Visual Studio Code, and Atom. You can also create HTML documents using an IDE like Visual Studio or Eclipse, and then there are tools for professional web designers like Dreamweaver. In this class, I'll use Visual Studio Code, which can be downloaded here. So notice that it has Windows version, a Mac OS version, and Linux version. You can just download the installer for your platform, install it, and then you are ready to go. This is what Visual Studio Code looks like. Once you start using it, you'll find lots of nice features. Here I just want to mention a few that I think are helpful to get you started. First, you can open a file or folder. Opening a folder, like this one, will show all the files in the folder in this panel. So it makes editing files in that folder very convenient. I always check the auto-save option, so I don't need to click save all the time. VS Code supports extensions that extends its functionality. So this one is the extensions tab. So click on it and you can see that I already have some extensions installed. For HTML beginners, I recommend the HTML hint extension. So you can search for extensions here, just type HTML hint and you'll find it here. This extension will highlight the problems in your HTML file and give you some explanations as shown in this example. So if you look at this example, you can see that it will give you some error markers on the declaration line and on this anchor tag and on this unordered list tag. And it will give you some explanations why they are wrong. So for beginners, it's very nice to have a tool like this to help you find potential problems. If you want to install it, just click the button here or here. VS Code also supports Emmet abbreviations, which are short code snippets that get expanded into larger chunks of code or text. For example, let's say I want to create a new HTML document. So I'll call it test.html, and I can simply type HTML column 5, and it will automatically expand into a template for a HTML5 document, which is quite convenient. And there are other features of Emmet abbreviations you can use. For example, here, if I want, not here, here if I want 3 div elements, I can say div times 3. It will give me 3 div elements. And if I want, let's say, some random text, I can type lorem, and it will give me a bunch of random text known as lorem ipsum. And let's say if I want 3 paragraphs of random text, I can say p times 3 and then lorem, and it will give me 3 paragraphs of random text. And then I can use a format document to format it, which now looks nicer. So Emmet abbreviations often makes tedious parts of writing HTML document a lot simpler. So after the video, please check out their websites and learn more from there. Now, with all the basics out of the way, let's learn some HTML tags. There are 2 general categories of elements in HTML, block elements and inline elements. Block elements always start on a new line, and the inline elements will stay in the same line. Here are the tags for headings and paragraphs. Let's see what they look like. I already have 3 paragraphs here. Let's add a level 1 heading here, CS3220 for 2020, and let's add a level 2 heading, section 1. And if we open it in a browser, you can see they look like this. So each element has some default styling associated with them. Level 1 heading, of course, has larger fonts, bolder fonts, and then smaller for level 2 heading, and then regular fonts for paragraphs. And there are a few other commonly used block elements, like pre-element for pre-formatted text. Now, Notice that in regular HTML elements, your new lines and your spaces are not preserved. For example, if you have multiple spaces between Lauren and Ipsum, they will not show up as multiple spaces in the browser, even though if you look at the source of the page, there are multiple spaces here. Similarly, for new line characters or line breaks, they will not be preserved in the browser display. However, if we change this to, say, a pre-element, notice that now those line breaks and those extra spaces are preserved and they are displayed in the document. And the block code element, as the name suggests, is for codes. And the div element is a general purpose block element used to structure a page into logical divisions that can be formatted, positioned, and/or processed. To a large extent, it's like the building block of a complex page, so it's probably the element that you'll see most often. Let's compare the div element with paragraph elements. I have a couple of paragraphs here, and then let's create, say, 3 divs with some random text. Okay, so if we go back and look inside the browser, we can see that paragraph elements have some default styling associated with them in terms of spacing. Each paragraph, for example, has a little bit spacing before and after. On the other hand, div has no built-in styling or default styling, and this makes div elements ideal for applying your own styling. And here are some other commonly used block elements for creating lists, either unordered lists or ordered lists. Both use the same list item tag inside them. So let's say, for example, we can create a list, unordered list that says Java, Python, and C#, for example. And then we can create an ordered list with code, sleep, and repeat. And this is what they look like. As you can see, it's very easy to create lists in HTML. And then there are the inline elements. As we mentioned, an inline element doesn't start a new line. Let's see a few examples. So here, we'll make this one cyclic, and we'll make this one strong, and we'll make this one code, so I click strong and code. And let's add a line break somewhere. So let's say we add a line break here. And this gives us a line break here. And then there's a general purpose inline element called span, which is kind of the inline version of div. And just like div, if you want to apply certain styling to a certain block of text, you can often surround the text in a span element and apply the styling to the span element. So all these are pretty straightforward. After the class, please create a test document like what I'm doing here. Just throw in some tags and see how they work. And then the anchor tag. Anchor tag is used to create hyperlinks to other web pages and so on. You can make a case that hyperlinks are what make a web page a web page. So needless to say, the anchor tag is very important. The basic form of an anchor element is like this. You specify the hyperlink URL in the href element, and the link text is in the content of the element. For example, we can say, where do we put that tag? Let's put the tag here. Let's make this a link. We'll say this one will link to www.calstateLA.edu, and then let's change this to CSULA. If we click on this, it goes to CSULA. Anchor tag by itself is pretty straightforward, but URLs can be a bit tricky. There are two types of URLs. Absolute URLs, which are full URLs starting with the protocol and then everything. These URLs are pretty simple. We've seen those before. The tricky part is the relative URLs. Depending on whether it starts with a slash or not, a relative URL can be relative to the root path or relative to the current path. And then you can use dot to represent the current folder and dot dot to represent the parent folder. Let's see some examples. Let's use some examples to see the differences. Now I'm going to connect to my server, and Visual Studio Code actually has a nice plugin that let me to connect to a server and edit files directly on the server. So I'm going to connect to the server first, and then wait until it's connected. I'm going to open a folder, and I'm going to open the folder var www html cysum. Okay. So in this folder, notice that I have a subfolder called CS3220, and I have two HTML files in there. One is called a.html that has a link to the other one, b.html. So to go to a.html in a browser, I just need to go to cysum.org/cs3220/a.html, and it shows this page. Right? So notice that the URL is my server/cs3220, which is the folder name, followed by the file name a.html, which is this one. Now, suppose I want to create a link from a.html to b.html. Because they are in the same folder, I can simply put b.html here as a relative URL. And if I click on the link, I go to b.html, everything works nice. However, what would happen if we add a slash in front of the relative URL? So let's put a slash here, and then we go back, we refresh, and we click the link again. Notice that now we cannot find b.html anymore. Pay attention to the URL. Notice that with the slash in front, now this relative URL becomes relative to the root path of the server, meaning that even though my original a.html is under the folder CS3220, if I click on this link, it actually goes to the root, and it's no longer CS3220/b.html, it's root b.html. Since I don't have a file there, of course, this will give us a 404 page not found error. Now, if we move B to outside, and we click on this link again, now it works because B is under the root folder of the server. So now we can find it again. So having slash and not having slash makes a big difference. It makes them two different type of relative URLs. So that's important. Now let's see a different case where let's say b.html is in a folder called image or img, and while a.html is in a different folder called CS3220. How do we make a relative URL linking from a.html to b.html? This is where we can use ... So we can say, first go to the parent folder, and then from there go to the img folder, and from there is b.html, right? So this now is our new relative URL, and if we refresh here and we click on here, it can find b.html, and notice the URL here. Now it goes from CS3220 up to the parent folder and then into the img folder. So this is how relative URL works. If you are not quite clear, again, just like what we did, create a couple of examples, try it out, and very quickly you'll get used to it. And using relative URL for your own website, generally speaking, is much better than using absolute URL, because your pages can be easily deployed to a different server without making any changes. So do get used to using relative URLs. In addition to linking to another page, you can use anchor tag to link to a location in the same page. This can be very helpful if you have a long web page and you want to help your readers to jump to a certain location in the page. All you need to do is to add an ID attribute to the element you want to jump to, then specify the ID value with a hash symbol in an anchor tag. Let's see an example here. So I do have a fairly long web page here, and let's say that we want to jump to CSULA paragraph here. So what we do is we give this paragraph an ID, and the ID value can be anything as long as it's unique within the page. So I'll just call it CSULA. And then here, let's say if I click on this, we'll jump to there. We'll say this one will jump to CSULA. And we can refresh, and we click on Java, And you can see that it tries to scroll all the way to CSULA because our page is not that long. It actually stops here because it cannot scroll anymore. But you'll get the idea. Now, speaking of ID attributes, there are some other attributes that are common to all HTML elements. These are called the core attributes. In addition to ID, there's title, which is used to create a tooltip to an element. For example, if I put a title, let's say here on this paragraph, and if I mouse over this paragraph, notice that there's a tooltip hello pops up. And then there are class and the style attributes, which are used for adding CSS classes and styles respectively. We'll talk about them when we get to CSS. Again, please check out the linked documents for additional attributes and how to use them. In addition to linking to another page or location inside the current page, you can embed an email address or a telephone number in a link by starting the href attribute with either mail to or tell. When someone clicks on the link, their email app or phone app will be opened with the email address or phone number. Another commonly used tag is image. Most browsers these days can display JPEG, GIF, PNG, and SVG images. You can use an image tag to embed them in a web page like this. I already have an image here. This is my son, by the way. And if I want to embed that image here, I can do image, the source attribute. Source attribute is the URL to the image. And since the image is in the same folder, I'm going to use a relative URL, and VS Code very helpfully lists all the files in the same folder. So I can simply choose that. And when you use an image tag, usually you want to use usually you want to include a alt attribute, stands for alternative text. This is useful for two scenarios. One is if for some reason the image no longer exists, this alternative text will be displayed, and also is good for accessibility of the website. So for people, for visually impaired people, they may use screen readers to visit your website, and the screen reader cannot read the image, obviously, but the screen reader will be able to read the alternative text, so your audience, even visually impaired audience of your website, can still get an idea of what this part of the web page is about. So I'm going to say my son's picture, and then the picture will be included. Now, without specifying any additional attributes, it will try to display the image in its original dimensions, but it may be too big, so we can specify either width or height or both. So I'm going to specify just width so that the height is automatically determined. And let's say I want 100 pixels for width. And now looks better. So images are easy to include. Just know how to use URL, and it's easy. But what about clickable image, right? What if I want to click the image and then go to another website or another location? That's also easy. All you need to do is just surround the image tag with an anchor tag. So for example, let's say I'll do Tosted LA again, and this time I'll put it around the image, and if I click the image, it will take me to the university website. Just like in XML, there are some special characters in HTML that should be replaced with escape sequences. The ones you'll encounter the most often are white space, less than and greater than symbols, and ampersand. You can check out the linked documents to see some additional special characters. Sometimes you may want to add comments to your HTML document, just like adding comments to a program. The syntax is this. You'll start with a bracket and then exclamation mark and then dash and dash and then your comments, and then end it with double dash plus a bracket. So just like this. Now I'm going to put some comments here that says this is a comment. So if you look at the page in a browser, notice that it's not shown in a browser, right? But if you look at the page source, you can see that it's indeed here. And just like programming comments, it's not shown to the regular user, but for other developers or for yourself, comments can serve as some additional information regarding the page. And this syntax is the same for both XML and HTML. Here's a brief recap of what we have covered for HTML basics. Page structure, some common block and inline elements, the anchor tag for links, and the image tag for images. Understand how to use absolute and relative URLs. Remember to escape special characters and know how to add comments. This is it. See you in the next video.